Ethics.
Trust.
Trust. Who are we going to trust?
Public needs to trust us.
The public needs to trust us. Absolutely. Any other reason for having ethics? Is anybody part of an organization that has a code of ethics? One thing that research has shown is that organizations that talk about ethics tend to be more ethical. And to me, whatever organization I'm involved with, whether it's the cemetery department or the tree department or my church or my school or whatever organization I'm involved with, I like to have a written code of ethics. Not that most codes of ethics are really pretty obvious when you read them, because I have a feeling when we share with you the GMCA Code of Ethics, most of you are going to be nodding your heads this way. You're not going to be frightened from it, because it is pretty much common sense. However, there have been a lot of black eyes in the cemetery business over the past 20 years. In my opinion, a lot of that started when we started moving away from the municipal cemeteries into the more public for-profit cemeteries. But we can all think of cemeteries or funeral homes that have made the front pages in our local newspapers. Is there anyone who hasn't had any in their local newspapers in the past 20 years where somebody did something that kind of gave us a black eye? Of course, we all remember Tri-State Crematory. That hasn't been that long ago. When was that? Maybe 10, 15 years ago. The Tri-State Crematory incident was not necessarily a cemetery incident, but it did involve the death care industry, and it kind of gave everybody a black eye, or a lot of saying, that's not me, I'm not a part of that, but how could such a situation ever happen? And a lot of us are still scratching our heads on that, is what was the motive on that, and why would somebody do something so crazy? And especially when doing the right thing in that case probably would have been easier and less expensive than doing what they did. But even in our local newspapers, or maybe not in the newspapers, because maybe it didn't make it that far, thank goodness, but we as cemeterians say, hey, did you hear what happened at the cemetery across town? Or did you hear what that funeral director did? And there's been so many instances that could have given us even a bigger black eye. Maybe some things happen in our own cemetery sometime where we say, phew, when the day's over, I'm glad we got that fixed before the media showed up or before the family got there. And for those of us that are more on the nonprofit side and not involved in the burial side of the program, burials are like a Broadway musical where when the audience gets there, it looks like everything's been rehearsed and practiced and it goes very smoothly. But for those of us that work behind the scenes with the shovels and the pickaxes, a lot of times we're scrambling at the last minute to get things fixed and in order as the funeral procession's coming down there. We're scrambling at the last minute so we can stay in there when the funeral gets there and it looks like, yeah, we've been waiting for you all morning. So there's a lot of things that happen behind the scenes in the cemetery business that the general public may or may not see. But it's very important that we have a code of ethics. Now, in the GMCA, back probably about 6 months ago, the executive committee approved a code of ethics. Dr. Susan Harrington did most of the work of compiling the ethics, putting them together. We fine-tuned them. We did some additions, changes, deletions, and we came up with that. And so the GMCA has a code of ethics. It's been published in our newsletter. It's on our website, gmcaweb.org. If you didn't hear that before, write it down. That's our website. It's worth going to. You can find a code of ethics. And for those of us that are computer illiterate, I brought copies for you. This is the way we used to do things before we had computers. I like the core of them. So if you would pass these around, feel free to take a copy. Feel free to put it in a frame and hang it in your office where your customers walk by so they can see it. Feel free to review it with your crews or with your board of directors or with your city, because the message that we're trying to get out by having a code of ethics is to say that we are striving to be an ethical organization. We mean the GMCA, but also your cemetery in your city. We've got to strive to be it. A lot of things that we talk about ethics now were common sense 50 years ago, and now they're not so common. And a lot of us who get in the cemetery business weren't in the cemetery business the previous day. All of a sudden, because we're a good worker, have good work ethics, the city manager comes and says, Daryl, I think he'd make a good cemetery director. And the next thing he knows, he's in a cemetery. He's probably never worked a day in his life in a cemetery before. He probably tried avoiding cemeteries before that, and now he's the manager of it. So what we're going to do is talk about the GMCA Code of Ethics. Because, for those of you that are professional members of the GMCA, and if you're not a professional member, it's not too late, the elections are coming up in November. Pat, how about the 11th through 15th of November is when we're having elections. We have several positions up for elections, including the president, the treasurer, and 4 of our 8 regional directors. We're on a 2-year rotating schedule, so half of our board is elected every other year. Also on the ballot is going to be the GMCA Code of Ethics with a yes or no vote. Do you support and approve of the Code of Ethics? Because right now, this is the Code of Ethics as established by the Executive Committee. What you will notice on here is the first word in our Code of Ethics. Hello. Let's try this. Is we. And we don't want the we to be the Executive Committee. We want the we to be the we. And not just the we in this room, but the we in our organization or all of our membership. We want this to be our Code of Ethics that we accept. If this is approved on the ballot in November, I assume at some point in time, as we revise our brochures and our membership applications, that somewhere where you put in your name and address and phone number, you're probably going to check the box that say, I agree to the GMCA Code of Ethics. And at some point, that will probably become a requirement of membership. I don't think there's anything controversial in here that's going to cause any heartburn, but we want the we to be we, all of us, of the people, by the people, for the people, we the people. We the members of the Georgia Municipal Cemetery Association. We. I am having difficulties. There we go. We the people. I better keep my finger here so I don't forget which button to push. We vow to honor our obligations. And yes, we see these ethics as an obligation. We vow to honor our obligations to the customers we serve, to their families, and to the general public at large. You know why we vow to do this? Because nobody else is doing this in our cemeteries, and we do have a certain obligation to do so. You're supposed to do that before you get up and give a presentation. Sometimes, you know, when you have breakfast right before the presentation, you don't get all your ducks in a row. But we, the members of the Georgia Municipal Cemetery Association, vow to honor our obligations to the customers we serve, their families, and the public at large. We will diligently strive to encourage the highest ethical practices in the operation, maintenance, and management of Georgia cemeteries. We as the GMCA are not just concerned about our cemeteries, because we all have some cemeteries that are special. It may be one cemetery, it may be, David said, like 10 cemeteries. I think they have it in LaGrange. So we have certain cemeteries that we are ultimately responsible for. But as members of the GMCA, we are concerned about all the cemeteries in Georgia. We have Georgia in our name. We're Georgia Municipal Cemetery Association. And even though municipal's in there, we have a lot of nonprofit members, and we're as much interested in nonprofit cemeteries as we are those municipal cemeteries. And basically of all Georgia cemeteries, even the ones that are privately owned and operated for profit, we have some interest in them providing ethical services too. We will foster a greater respect for the cemetery management profession. You hear us all the time saying, We get no respect. We're the cemetery managers. Who gets respect in the city? Well, it's police and fire, of course, right? Police get the respect. When there's budget cuts, guess whose budget doesn't get cut? The mayor's no longer here. We do have another mayor over here. But police and fire, you can't cut them, can you? And of course, water and sewer and sanitation, they're up there high on the totem pole. Public works, street maintenance. Where's cemeteries on the totem pole? And if not on the bottom, probably 6 feet under the bottom. Way down there. Fortunately, in Savannah, we have a cultural affairs department, so we're not alone at the bottom, but we're down there with a few other departments. But we're not at the top. But the cemetery management profession is an important profession. Even though historically, in many of our cities and nonprofit organizations, we take a guy who's good at the lawnmower and say, hey, that cemetery manager who's been here 40 years, he's going to retire, so it's going to be your job now. And our cemetery profession historically has been kind of a forgotten, leftover pass on. But we have several people in this room and several people throughout Georgia who have been doing this for 20, 30, 40 years. And hopefully through the GMCA, we can help those who have been doing it for 3 or 4 months and bring them into it and get this higher level of professionalism. Because we want the respect, and you know what? We're going to earn that respect, because the cemetery manager's not just some guy who digs the graves when you tell him to. He's going to be there watching out for the cemetery and making sure that other people are respecting the cemetery that he's working in. So just repeating what I just said, and it's on your sheet right here. We, the members of the Georgia Municipal Cemetery Association, remember the we, capital W, we vow to honor our obligations to the customers we serve, their families, and to the public at large. We will diligently strive to encourage the highest ethical practices in the operation, maintenance, and management of Georgia cemeteries, and by so doing, will foster a greater respect for the cemetery management profession. And we have a list of things that we pledge. As GMCA members, we pledge, and those of you that are professional members, you're going to be voting on this soon, so make sure you're on the same sheet with me. And if there's something up here that gives you heartburn, we may need to talk about it. I don't think there will be. We pledge to demonstrate the utmost respect and dignity to the human remains entrusted to us. And a lot of people don't think about this when they get in the cemetery business. They think it's about cutting grass and maybe setting headstones upright. The human remains side of our business are so important. That's why we have cemeteries. We have cemeteries to remember the people that are buried there and the bodies. And when I got in the cemetery business, I kind of thought it was up to the funeral director to be in the lead of showing respect to the dead bodies. And I know we have some funeral director members here too, and there are some very good funeral directors in the state. But I've also had funeral directors pull up to a grave that's been prepared for an indigent and take that indigent body out of the back of the car. And I see some of you shaking your head because you know what I'm talking about. And I don't even know that I want to finish this story, but let's just say not real respectful. And that's where I think we, the cemetery people, have to say, time out. If you're going to come into my cemetery, you're going to do it right. Speaking of indigent burials, we have a special place for infants of indigent burials. And one day as I'm driving through the cemetery, I see 3 small boxes sitting on the side of the road. Yeah. I knew what they were. The funeral director who got paid, and I think back then it was $75, but I don't care if it's $75 or $750,000 if you've got the remains of a baby in a box. You don't pull up at the cemetery first thing in the morning and drop them by the side of the road so the cemetery can bury those remains. I'm sorry, not in my cemetery. But it has happened. Fortunately, it wasn't on the front page of the morning news, but it has happened. We cannot allow that. We as cemetery managers, or as cemetery nonprofit organizations, or really just the general public who happens to visit cemeteries, we have to demand the dignity to the human remains entrusted to us. We pledge to serve our customers and their families with respect. Gee, back in the old days, that was kind of a given. But we all know where customer service has gone. You know, that's a whole other topic. But in the cemetery business, it's all about customer service. Come on, we don't make any money at it. You know, we don't do it for the money. It's about the customer service. It's about whether you're in the nonprofit as a volunteer or whether you're a public servant who gets a paycheck, but guess what? It's not that huge. It's there. It's all about the customer service. We need to serve our customers and their families with respect, compassion, and confidentiality. We're dealing with some pretty serious stuff here. We have to honor their religious, ethnical, and personal beliefs. We may not agree with them, but we do have an obligation to honor them. Because in all of our cemeteries, with the exception of a few religious cemeteries, but even most religious cemeteries have multiple religions and multiple ethnicities and multiple races and people with beliefs. And it's our job as a cemetery to respect what the people want. I actually interviewed somebody once. He didn't get hired, but he says, oh yeah, I worked in a cemetery, and we'd sit in the office, and depending on the car of the customer that drove up, we would determine what section we were going to show them grave spaces in. You drive up in an old beat-up car, we're going to take you out to the economy section. You pull up in a Mercedes, we're going to take you over to the high-price section. Wait a second. You can't make those assumptions about people. As public cemetery managers, we've got to show people what we have. Because you know what? I know some millionaires that drive around in old beat-up pickups. I also know millionaires that want to have a very modest burial ground. So trying to assume what somebody wants, I also know people that I would consider to be in poverty that spend a considerable sum of money on burials. For whatever reason, it's their belief. I finally learned late in my life, but it's been 15 or 20 years ago. It was a Korean family, I believe, and they wanted something big on their lot. And I don't know how wealthy they were or anything else, but in talking with them, this was the first generation that came to this country. And 5, 6, 7 generations in the future, our family's going to come back to this side because Dad was the first person in this country. Well, a lot of us have colonial cemeteries and Victorian cemeteries in our city, and we see these huge monuments. Our assumption is those people were just wealthy because we could never afford those monuments today, but perhaps they had similar views. This is the first of the family to come to the New World, and people for generations to come are going to trace themselves back to here. So we don't want to make assumptions about people. We want to serve all of our families with respect, and one way to respect them is to show them everything we have available. We have lots over there, we have lots over there. We have low prices, we have high prices, we have in the middle prices, whatever we have. It's our obligation to treat our customers with respect. We also pledge to assist our customers and their families to the best of our abilities as they memorialize the lives lived by their loved ones. Memorialization is monuments. We have rules, we have regulations. We talked about them yesterday. We're going to talk about them some more. However, one of the main purposes of a cemetery, second to a place to put dead bodies, is to memorialize those dead bodies. It's the art museum, the history class. People say, well, that's not carved in stone. Well, in the cemetery, a lot of times it is carved in stone. That's what we want to say about our loved ones. I'm not saying to bend the rules or to change the rules, but it's our job as professionals to let people know what it is that they are allowed to do, and then to assist it to the best of our abilities. And we got some pretty strong abilities in this room, and we need to live up to them. We need to maintain and publish specific cemetery rules and regulations and apply them fairly to the customers and cemetery visitors. Now, if you happen to have a cemetery that doesn't have rules, I don't want you to go thinking, oh my goodness, we're unethical. I want you to go out and publish some rules. And you don't need to do it tomorrow. Just start jotting down. You probably have rules. They may be unwritten rules, or they may be those rules that were written back in 1873 by the people that started the cemetery, and you sort of follow them today. But I think it's important that we know what's allowed and what's not allowed. Because if customer number 1 comes out to me and I say, You can only have a flat stone on your grave, and customer number 2 comes over and he argues with me for 3 weeks, and I finally say, oh, go ahead, just put in a upright stone if that's what you want. Now I'm being inconsistent. It's just important to treat our customers fairly. We got to have rules that are consistently applied, that are fair, and that are easy to understand. And as soon as we're done with these Code of Ethics, we're going to start on some standardized rules for people that don't have rules in their cemeteries, and the GMCA is going to assist people develop rules who don't have rules. And at some point, possibly ordinances and standard operating procedures and other things of that nature. As GMCA members, we pledge to be aware of federal, state, and local laws and regulations relating to cemeteries, to adhere to them, and to be able to explain them to families in an understandable manner. Once again, if you're new to the business and you don't know all those regulations, don't go running out of here saying I'm an unethical person. But in the process of your normal day business, let's get familiar with them. The State Cemetery Act, it doesn't apply to municipal cemeteries, but guess what? I suggest you be familiar with it. That's the requirements for privately operated cemeteries. Why should we be familiar with it? Because as municipal cemeteries, we should be at their level plus up higher. In my opinion, as municipal cemeteries, we have a higher level of standards than what's required for private cemeteries. And really, those rules and regulations, that's the minimum. Who wants to be known as being at the minimum? You know, that's the minimum standards that private cemeteries must do. Well, I hope even our minimum standards are higher than their minimum standards, but our real practice standards should be even higher still. We have that obligation. How do you find out about cemetery laws? Well, try Facebook, Twitter, our website, newsletters, coming to workshops, coming to meetings, talking about it, asking someone who's been doing it. If you come to a situation you've never dealt with before, call Stan Rogers. He's been doing it for 25 years. How many? He's shaking his head. A long time. He's been doing it a long time. He's probably dealt with it before. Or call the State Historic Preservation Division. They're familiar with the laws. They've compiled a bunch of them in the books. And there's more laws that they haven't compiled yet. But just get yourself familiar with that. Just because someone told you that that's the way it's always been, it's probably a good idea to look it up, because there's a lot of, I don't want to call them old wives' tales, because a lot of times you hear them from old men, but it's like, oh yeah, you can do that. And it's like, no, you can't. You know, maybe you did it, and maybe your father did it, but the law says you can't do it. As GMCA members, we pledge to develop, promote, and reinforce good safety practices throughout our operations. We don't want our crews getting hurt. We don't want the public visiting our cemeteries getting hurt. Has anybody ever had an open grave and had someone fall into it while they were looking into it? We have. We've got to keep our cemeteries placed. Now, our rural cemeteries, they're rural cemeteries. They may not be ADA compliant. There may be tripping hazards, roots, rocks, whatever are out there, and we understand that. However, as cemetery managers, we still have an obligation to keep those areas safe for our workers, for our volunteers, for the general public at large. That's an ethical consideration. As GMCA members, we pledge to maintain and preserve all vital cemetery and ownership records in a manner whereby they are attainable by all subsequent generations. Now, does that mean if your records were in the courthouse that burnt down in 1820 that you're unethical? No. There's nothing that can be done about that. That's in the past. Or maybe you had one of those cemetery managers for 20 years that couldn't read and write and spell, and he did the best job he did, but you know, you've got these old ledger books that are full of chicken scratch. And I have a lot of respect for chickens now, so and chicken scratch. Whatever the case, what's in the past is in the past. If you had a burial yesterday and didn't keep a record, I suggest if you do a burial tomorrow, you do keep records on there. As a cemetery manager, what we have from the past is what we have. And if we can improve that and build upon it, that's great. But what's really important is starting today, if not sooner, if not the day you started on the job, if you're a new person starting in an old cemetery, and I talked to some people yesterday that stumbled upon a cemetery out in the woods, you stumbled upon a cemetery out in the woods. There may not be a single record of that, but guess what? You can go out there today with a camera, with a pen and a paper, and you can start recording that. Especially if you're a cemetery manager, if you're a nonprofit organization dedicated to a cemetery, get your records, get them preserved, and make sure they're going to be around. Back when the courthouse burned down in 1820, they probably only had one copy of records. Well, guess what? They didn't have Xerox machines back then, or computers, or the World Wide Web, or all these things that we have. There's no excuse to lose the records that we're creating today. We've got the cloud, whatever that is, I don't know, but apparently you can fit a lot of stuff up there. And a lot of our records that we have can somehow go up in the cloud, and someday when we're up in the clouds, those records will still be attainable to people that are down here below the clouds. We pledge to promote the maintenance of all interment sites and the cemetery grounds in a manner consistent with the best practices of historic preservation and landscape maintenance. Even if you have a brand new cemetery, you're starting the historic preservation for the next generation, because just the nature of cemeteries, they're going to become historic. By definition, historic now is 50 years old, so that makes most of us eligible for the National Register. There's a few spring chickens in here, so I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush. I'm still 3 years short of it, so I can't be on there yet, but cemeteries will become historic. You don't go out and spend $300 to $3,000 to $30,000 on a headstone and engrave stuff in there if you don't plan on being around for a while. So we've got to be in historical preservation. And most of us in the municipal cemetery or nonprofit cemetery business, we're dealing with old cemeteries. We're dealing with cemeteries that are 50 years or older. We got to take care of landscape maintenance. I've seen the cemeteries that don't have a piece of vegetation on them, that are covered with sand or stones or something. Whatever the landscape is, we got to maintain that landscape consistent with best management practices. When a tree and a headstone are fighting for the same piece of ground, sometimes we have to make ethical decisions based on what we see out there. But whatever the case, we're maintaining the landscapes, we're maintaining the monuments and the stones and the graves. Even if it's an unmarked grave, we have an obligation to maintain that space in some sort of condition. We pledge to protect all cemetery contracts and funds and assure that customers understand the exact stipulations of the contract and specifically what they are purchasing. Many of us have perpetual care agreements or something of that nature, some type of contracts or endowment funds. As municipal cemeteries, we're not required to, but many of us do that anyway. There are a lot of state laws for the private cemeteries that have endowment funds, and they have a minimum amount of money that they must put in their funds, and guess how much they put in there? The minimum, not a dime more. For those of us in the cemetery business, does the minimum from 100 years ago do anything today? No. If you're a real financial manager and you're starting a cemetery, and your job for that cemetery is not to maximize your personal profit on there, but to really manage the cemetery, the amount you need to put in your endowment fund should be considerably above and beyond what the minimum is that state law requires. Nevertheless, state law does have a minimum amount for private cemeteries. For those of us in the public, most of us are operating in the red anyway. That's why our cemeteries are public or nonprofit, because there's not a lot of money to be made in them. We don't do it for the money. Nevertheless, whatever funds we do have, even if it's $20,000 to maintain $1 million cemetery, we've got to manage those funds in a responsible way. And that doesn't mean lining our own pockets. That means managing the funds so that the maximum amount will be there in 100 years and 200 years and beyond. We pledge to safeguard all endowment or perpetual care funds. I think I just talked about that. The previous one is more about the contracts. This is about the funds, but they go hand in hand. to assure the continual maintenance of the cemetery. That's what the endowment funds are for. It's someone will be cutting grass 100 years from now. How much is it going to cost to cut grass 100 years from now? Considering we sold contracts 100 years ago for what, about $15? And now $15 doesn't buy us a cup of coffee at Starbucks for the whole week. You know, it's not very much. $15 doesn't go anywhere today. However, we made an agreement 100 years ago that we'd cut that grass till the end of time for $15. Yeah, we'd better do the best with it that we can. Hopefully that $15 has generated a little bit of interest. We pledge to assist and educate fellow cemeterians and to promote the universal principles by which all cemeteries should operate. That's where the networking comes in that we've been talking about here for the past day and a half. It's not just us. I love my cemeteries in Savannah. I really care about my cemeteries in Savannah. I'm going to learn everything I can about state laws, national laws, best management practices, and everything else so I can manage my cemeteries in Savannah. But guess what? I care about all these other cemeteries too. And because Savannah has been blessed with the cemeteries department, an operating budget, some highly competent people, several who are in the room here today, to manage our cemeteries, I feel some obligation to share our knowledge, our experience with other people. And the founders of the GMCA, Stan Rogers is with us today, and Henry, and several others here, that was our whole purpose of getting the GMCA. Because we worked hard to learn what we learned, and we know that someday we're not going to be here anymore. And someone else is going to work hard. So what we're trying to do is to perpetuate what we have stumbled through, so when the new people come on board, we can pass it on to them easily instead of making them learn it all through the school of hard knocks. We do have a mutual interest in cemetery management. Even before the GMCA, we'd get calls every now and then, hey, I'm a new cemetery manager in such and such a city, and somebody came to me and said they want to do a disinterment. Can they do that? You know, well, let's go have coffee and talk about it a little bit, and let's find out what the situation is so that we can do it right. Because you know what? Nobody else in the city organization knows. We have some elected officials with us today. Elected officials, by the fact that they're elected, doesn't make them experts in every municipal field. And because cemeteries is way down here on the totem pole, or way down there, and other things are up here, they're more likely to be experts with the things up there because those are the things that are hitting them every day. The city managers and bureau chiefs and department heads and those people, they may or may not know about cemeteries. We talked yesterday that cemeteries may be in public works, or it may be in parks and rec, or it may come under the clerk of council. These guys are busy people. I've got 300 calls a day about potholes, and we do a burial once a week. You know, they're going to be a pothole expert. But somebody, somewhere down that totem pole, is responsible for the cemetery. And whoever that is, most of the people in this room here, many of our colleagues around the state who aren't in this room, we are responsible just by the nature of our job, but we also want to spread the wealth, share what we learned with others. We pledge to diligently attempt to assure that no owner, manager, or employee shall engage in any illegal or unprofessional conduct while servicing families or maintaining cemeteries. We mentioned some of those examples earlier about these types of things. It's us. We can't count on the funeral directors or the monument companies or the elected officials or the bosses or whoever to police the whole thing. It's up to us. It starts with ourselves. We got to keep ourselves ethical, but then we got to keep our co-workers, our subordinates, our peers, whoever around us, hold everybody up to high standards. How do we do that? We do it by talking about ethics. Not just once, we approve it, it's approved, file it away, we'll never see it again. No, we need to pull out the ethics on a regular basis, and hopefully, we're going to have a conference next year in Augusta, we're probably going to be talking about ethics again. Not for the whole conference, maybe for the whole conference, but when we do cemetery workshops, when we meet with our crews or department head meetings, we need to talk about ethics. Because the more we talk about it, the more likely we are to be ethical. And we pledge to report any questionable activities or practices to the proper authorities. Once again, when you see stuff and it just doesn't look right, we talked about some of these earlier, what are you going to do about it? If you sweep it under the rug, it may come back and haunt you later. Although it may not, because we in the cemetery business knows that people cut corners 20 years ago and 50 years ago, and every now and then, next time you have a burial, it comes up and hits you in the face. But once you find out that something wasn't right, fix it. And fixing it may be writing a note on the burial record that this grave is partially in that grave or in someone else's lot or whatever the case might be. Document it, keep it transparent, put it out on the table, say, hey, previous generation, they messed up, but my generation, we fixed it. Because I don't want to pass on to the next generation. I hope 50 years down the road when people are going through our records that they don't find any problems that were created during that period of time, that brief period in time where I was involved with the cemeteries. They're going to find some from before because I find them all the time. But a lot of those are cleaned up and it's going to make it easier. That's what our goal is. So we, us, our cemeterians, our professionals, we offer this code of ethics as a standard to which all cemeteries should adhere.